Welcome you to the 2021 version of Pastor School. This annual resourcing event is CBF of Virginia's gift to you every year. I wish that we could be face-to-face this year, as we have done in the past. But given the fact that I don't think they would allow Anna to cross the border, and I don't think most of us would be willing to travel, I am delighted that we can gather in this particular way for this virtual experience. And before I say anything else, I want to say a word of gratitude to you, pastors and leaders here in Virginia. This has been such a difficult season, and I know you're carrying a lot of stress. So we give thanks to God for you, and we are grateful for your ministry among us and for all the ways you are remaining faithful as you provide leadership. We believe that the focus of this pastor school is very timely, recalibrating faith and culture in a post-pandemic world. Not only are we struggling to make it through this protracted season, we're wondering what the church is going to look like on the other side. Our keynote speaker is committed to serving Christ's mission in the world. Dr. Robbins' ability to apply the gospel to real-life issues and relationships with justice, innovation, academic rigor, and joyful expectation is exactly what we need today. This gifted teacher has an international profile in theology and apologetics, ethics, and contemporary culture. Since July of 2019, Dr. Anna Robbins has served as president of Acadia Divinity College and dean of theology at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, in Canada. She carries many titles, 4 or 5 that I see listed on their website. Please read about her extensive credentials in our promotional materials, lest we spend all of our time just articulating those. Anna's passion is to help people engage well with matters of contemporary culture and faith, and we believe that her perspective is going to inspire and encourage you today. And even though Dr. Robbins lives in Canada, she knows us well. She knows our context well, and I picked up on that pretty quickly as we had conversation together. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Robbins to Pastor School 2021. Anna, we welcome you here as a faithful voice and as a prophet, and we welcome the Spirit of the living God as our teacher.
Amen. Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you to all of you for the invitation to share with you. As Terry was saying, it's my passion to just help leaders in particular, but the church more generally, to engage well with the culture in which we live, because I think so many times when there has been a lack of understanding of culture or awareness or willingness to do that work, that those are the kinds of times when the church has struggled the most, I think. And we're at a time of great upheaval, as we know. And so I think the work done in these days is crucial. And so I am really passionate about that. At the same time, I'm very aware that you come with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. I don't see myself as the sage on the stage in that sense, but much more, I think what I tend to do is hold up a mirror for people in the first instance to say, this is what we're dealing with. This is what it looks like. And then to name it, and so the things that I tend to talk about, there's a lot usually of recognition of, yes, that's what I experienced in the church. I didn't know how to give word to it or voice to it. And so I hope that that's one thing we'll be able to do together today. I'm also an extrovert, and so I really like to be with people, and being with you on the screen is really only a secondary second to what we could have had if we were together. And I recognize that where you are sitting on the screen with the other demands coming in around you, that it's a challenge. And so my hope is we'll be able to engage together as much as possible. I love interaction. I don't mind being interrupted, not constantly, but sometimes at least. And I hope my desire would be not to simply talk about things that I'm excited about, but to allow those things to connect with the questions that you have and the things that you're dealing with and where you want to go with it. So this morning, what I had planned to do is to talk about introduce really a little bit of a genealogy of culture in the 20th century, just very briefly to kind of draw us some parameters, and then to look at this whole crisis of malaise of culture and meaning, because we've been in this pandemic season now for almost a year. We've realized now that we have to shift from sprint to marathon, and that demands a whole different set of muscles in ministry leadership. From when you're sprinting and you're trying to respond to what's happening quickly all the time, and you think, how much longer can this go on? And it's gone on a lot longer than most of us had hoped or anticipated. And so um, uh, training for the marathon is kind of where we're at. I think another issue that's happened in these pandemic days is that it's the higher brain, the mammalian brain of reason, um, that is our imagination. Our imagination lives in that part of our brain. When we're in a crisis mode, we're in fight or flight. We're in our survival brain. And I think that for a lot of leadership, we've been stuck in that mode for so long. It's very hard to imagine and to be able to lift out of that crisis mode of fight or flight, to be able to engage once again with imagination. And yet I feel quite convinced that if we don't engage with imagination for the future, we will find ourselves in some difficult places when the large restrictions of a pandemic world are over. And we can see how much the changes that were coming anyway have simply been accelerated in a pandemic time. And that acceleration means that we don't have time, I don't think, as churches, to lag along behind. And yet in the crisis of the moment, that's what it's going to feel like, I think. So my hope is that we'll be able to reflect on some of these things today. I hope your imagination will be stoked and inspired. But that's only going to happen if you're able to. If you're able to, I invite you to shut off your email and those other things that come in and make demands of time, not so that you can just listen to what I'm saying, but so that you can listen for what the Spirit is saying to you where you are for your context. And if my words help that way, that's great. If the Spirit speaks to you without me, that's probably even better, to be honest. But there we are. I wonder if you would pray with me as we begin. Lord, you have called us to this time and this place, and we don't really have a choice about that. We have to deal with the times we're given, but we pray, Lord, for wisdom. We pray for insight. Lord, I pray for these leaders that you will renew them by your Spirit and their inner being, that they would be energized and filled with just that vision that only you can bring for how you want your church to be in this age. Lord, we know there are so many who just need Jesus, and whatever that looks like in their lives, Lord. And we so want to be the conduit for that and servants of yours. So, Lord, would you equip us today, however you choose to do that? Make us available to you for your forming of our hearts and minds today. We pray as we commit this time and one another to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. A few years ago, I was teaching in Ukraine, and it was the first time I'd ever been there. It was very interesting, and while I was there, I had a lot of new experiences. But one of the experiences I had in particular was kind of shocking. It's one of those things that sticks in your mind, and you never really forget about it, and maybe could be included in your list of things that you wish you had never actually experienced. So I just finished teaching this intensive week in ethics, and I was sleeping in bed. Unusually for me, my head was out. I was out like a light as soon as my head hit the pillow. I usually take quite a long time to drift off, but there I was. And out of a sound sleep, I was awoken by what I first thought was somebody shaking the bed, telling me to wake up. And I first thought, well, who's in my room? And so I leaned up on my elbows and looked around carefully, peering into the dark, and I couldn't see anybody there. And then I thought, well, what's going on? And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm having a heart attack. It's causing my whole body, to move and to sway. And then, of course, it was really within seconds that it dawned on me, slow of brain, what was actually happening. And many of you will probably know long before I did what was actually going on. Anybody? You can type in the chat if you don't want to shout out, but I'm really happy with the interaction either way. Anybody know what was going on? Can you tell what was happening? Yes, of course. Thank you. It was an earthquake. I had never been in an earthquake before. That was a whole new experience for me. And I was on the ninth floor of a hotel in Kiev. And I have to say, when this was happening, I thought, this is how it's going to end for me, on the ninth floor of a jury hotel in Kiev. And I thought this was the end of life for me, because the first thing you think is how much can a hotel that was built in Kiev actually withstand this kind of shaking before it's all over. So it was a very, very strange thing in terms of the things that went through my mind and so on. But thankfully, by the time things stopped, my mind had also stopped. I looked out the window, everything seemed to be calm. I went back to bed and back to sleep because all was well. An earthquake is a dramatic and disorienting event, particularly if it's a severe earthquake, which this thankfully was not. But in many ways, Western culture has been experiencing an earthquake, and this cultural quake has shaken the very foundations of our commitments, of our faith, of our understanding, our institutions. And the earthquake it's seen the collapse of what were previously broadly held certainties, confidences of things we thought we could count on. And this shaking of the foundations has left many Christians and their churches disoriented. Disoriented because, especially unlike an earthquake, the cultural changes that have left us in this state didn't happen just in a few seconds and then leave us to kind of survey the landscape. The shaking has continued. It's been a long process of shaking. And you're left wondering sometimes how much shaking is too much before it can no longer withstand the shaking, before the church can no longer withstand the shaking, before our institutions can no longer hold up under the strain. How much shaking is too much before the whole thing just collapses and we're left to make sense in the rubble of things if our faith manages to survive that experience at all? I wonder from you if this is how you have experienced the rapid cultural shifts of the last few decades. Has it felt like that for you? And I would just, again, I'd love to hear a little bit of feedback, because otherwise I'm just talking to a screen and that's no good for me. So yes, no, just a sense of, does that resonate with you at all? Or are you thinking, no, it's just not where I'm at? I get a few nods for sure. Okay. Okay, so we're having some resonance here. That's good. That's good. Thanks for that feedback. There's also down on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, I'm not looking for you to, uh, give the party one if we're not having a good time. But sometimes if you want to engage and interact, that's a good way to give some immediate feedback, and that will help me too. So you have an applause, you can forget that one. I don't need that. But a thumbs up. Laughter. I don't know if we're going to be funny. That would be really good if I could find something funny enough to say to make you laugh. Surprise, shock. There's who chooses these selections is what I'd like to know. Those aren't the things I would choose to put there. But if you want to give me some feedback without being vocal, feel free to do that. But I'm happy with your voice too. So I think we have a bunch of preachers here. I'm sure you have great voices. So this is how we're experiencing this rapid shift, is this shaking. Now, most of us, when we were in seminary somewhere, studied a little bit of Niebuhr. Anybody study Niebuhr, the Christ and Culture book that he wrote in the 50s out of his lectures from Yale? And it became a classic. Everyone who passed through seminary really had to read Niebuhr's Christ and Culture. Some of you remember it well. And of course, Niebuhr developed this typology of how he saw the church relating to culture over the history of the church. And then he developed these into different categories. And you'll remember what some of those categories were. Christ of culture, Christ against culture were the two poles. And then there were moderating positions in between: Christ above culture, Christ and culture and paradox, and so on. Of course, as time went on, Niebuhr's typology became critiqued, because some said, well, what does it mean really when he talks about Christ against culture? He really wasn't talking about Jesus being for or against culture. He was really talking about the story of the church. And then what does it mean when he talks about culture? And the Anabaptists especially pushed back hard on that and said, what does it mean to be against culture? I like to go to an art gallery. Does that mean I'm against culture or for culture? What does that mean to be basically for or against culture? And so the types got critiqued. Nevertheless, I think they still provide an interesting orientation for us in terms of how the culture has responded to this earthquake that we've been experiencing. And I think churches collectively, in many places, have responded in one of these polarized ways. On the one hand, it seems like the church has almost disappeared into culture in some places and some denominations, that that you can't even distinguish between what is of the church, what is of faith, and what's going on in the culture. And sometimes that happens on both left and right poles. Um, on the left, there's a sense that, well, culture really sets the agenda and so on. And so we've seen an extreme decline of many mainline denominations and so on across North America and across the Western world. The church almost disappears within the culture. I lived for 15 years in the UK and watched before my eyes the deterioration of the church in Europe. To be honest, it was astonishing. Of course, what I was experiencing of that was really just um, the last realization of changes that had already taken place. But I visited Amsterdam once, and to try and find a church to attend on Sunday took days. And even then, I really was not successful. There were many buildings around. That wasn't the problem. But the church buildings weren't churches. And the churches were elsewhere, but where were they? There were not many, and they were not easy to find. And Amsterdam, being the place where our Baptist faith was founded by Smith and Helwys, you got to wonder what's going on. And so that was a stark experience. I also, when we were first in the UK, lived 5 years um, in Wales, and the church in Wales was a very interesting thing because it's the land of revival, right? Wales. That's where, um, you know, if you read anything about revivals, Wales is the place where the 18th century, 19th century saw great revivals of faith across the culture. And what we experienced in Wales, though, was that Christianity had become so latent within the culture that there was nothing that marked out someone who was a person of faith or of belief. And it was there was a church on every hill, and my husband and I, between us, he was a pastor, and we would preach between us 5 or 6 chapels, and you go to one and there'd be 5 people, another one with 3 people, and by the end of it, we decided we were probably not being helpful to continue the pain, to be honest, for these churches, because we could not encourage them to get together as hard as we tried and so on. And it didn't surprise us when we visited after we moved to London and went back about 5 years, not even 5 years later. Not only had all of these little churches on the hills closed down, which we fully expected would happen, what really shocked us was that the large town churches that were thriving and going concerns just 5 years earlier were also closed down. It happens almost overnight. And so when we returned to Canada, to Eastern Canada, which is where I grew up, I can see our churches in the very, very same position. That the cultural changes that had happened there have now taken place here. They've crossed over the ocean. And I have said to our denomination here, our Baptist denomination, I don't know that we have 5 years to sort this out. Like, I'm not sure that we do. And that sounds really, um, a perilous kind of judgment. And I don't mean it in judgment whatsoever. I mean it as an urgent call to action, to be honest, because we are put here, I think, in this place and time because the Lord has given us what we need to be able to respond to this earthquake, to this shaking of the foundations with enthusiasm, with spirit-led compassion, with justice, and all of those things that the gospel calls us to. So all of that to say, on the one hand, a Christ of culture response as the church in the midst of these changes means that the church basically disappears into culture. And whether that's by seeking to take control of government on the one hand, or just disappearing because there's no distinguishing features of the church on the other. And I think, again, in a polarized world, the two positions of Christ of culture, Christ against culture, are the main positions that the church has responded to these cultural shakings by following. The other one then being, of course, the Christ against culture. And the Christ against culture response, I think, is very interesting because it's one we would be more exposed to, I think, as Baptist people, which is a position of exile within culture. You're familiar with this, right? That, the cries that say, well, actually, we're in exile. And there by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. And that's us today. We're in exile from culture. Woe is us, the church. And I have actually elsewhere developed an argument where I think actually that is not the position that we are in. I think what has happened is that actually the church has been too long comfortable in our cultural skin, and we've been too much the church of culture, that we wouldn't know what it would mean to be in exile anyway. Because there are churches, of course, as we know, across the world who know exactly what it means to be in exile. They know what it is to be persecuted. They know what it is to be under fire. In a context where still the vast majority of the population believes in a Christian God, we're not in exile. And if we put ourselves in exile, my worry is that we risk not being able to have the kind of impact that the church still could have in our communities, and in our society, not to control the politics of our society, but to have an impact for the things that concern the heart of God, things like justice, things like peace, things that Baptists have long been committed to and need to bear witness to. And if we claim a position of exile, we can very, very easily just simply circle our wagons against the world and say, stay out. And it may not be our intention to do that, but that can be the outcome of that kind of response. I'm happy to have a chat about that at some point in a little while, if that's helpful, because I know for some people that that is considered to be a little bit controversial because there are so many who like that position of exile. And there's something valuable in it for sure, because it's seeking to distinguish our identity from within the culture. It's seeking to bear a witness to a different way of being within the culture. And those Anabaptist strands resonate with me too. But I think if we go too far in that direction, we will risk losing our prophetic potential within the culture to act with prophetic power and to speak prophetically as well. At a time when, at a crucial time in history, when certainly the voice of I mean, who has more to say about a reconciling justice than Jesus? There's a voice that needs to be heard, and my fear is always that if we put ourselves into a position of exile too quickly, we won't be able to allow Jesus to speak, which is really what we're about. I hope. What I want to talk about then, having just kind of set that scene, is to move into a little bit of a discussion around how we got here from there. Because what I really want to talk with you today is the idea of malaise and meaning. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Charles Taylor, the philosopher out of McGill in Montreal, but he's had a good impact across North America in certain circles as an interpreter of culture. He's the best I've encountered. He has a book that he has many different books, but his book, The Secular Age, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's about that thick. And I've been working with it since 2007 when it was published. And I'm still getting gems out of it. It's one of those, where it takes you a long time to work through it. And then you just want to start over again. Anybody familiar with Charles Taylor? Anyone? A little bit. James Smith Jamie Smith has done a lot of work on Taylor, and so you may have seen him through that lens as well, which is another possibility. Anyway, I like to riff on Taylor because he talks a lot about how we have a cultural malaise, a malaise of imminence. And when Taylor talks about the malaise of imminence, they really emerge from from modernity, when modernity comes to ferment, which again is this earthquake that we're in. Modernity being that time of big ideas, I probably should dial back just for a second and talk about post-modernity for a minute, because although it is a word that is now in some ways passé and tired and misused, what it does for us is signal this earthquake. And it signals the earthquake in the sense that we have become disconnected in many ways from the ideas that that we could build up our rationality and our programs and everything on shared and given foundations. And the postmodern chips away at those foundations and says they don't exist. And so then you've got to find another way of positing meaning in culture. And so at the end of modernity, Taylor says that what culture is experiencing is malaise. You know what malaise is, right? It's that a sense that things aren't right, a kind of a dreariness, maybe a mild depression. It's this sense that things aren't right. And he calls this malaise a malaise of immanence, because we have lost a sense of God, a sense of transcendence that balances that malaise. You know, as we've entered into this era of post-Christendom, where yes, okay, the vast majority of people still have some kind of Christian faith, but how much are people actually selling out themselves to be disciples of Christ? That's much fewer people. And we can see the sea change of decline of church attendance and belief and so on sweeping across the Western world. It's I'm shocked it hasn't happened yet, but post pandemic, I do think it's going to drop off pretty quick. It already is north of your border, so up here our church decline is behind that of Europe. But is ahead of where you are, but it's coming because the cultural influences that bring it about are the same. That's just the reality. So you have the advantage of watching, I guess, and seeing what's coming, and then seeing some of what works and what doesn't, to be honest. So we have this cultural malaise of immanence when we lose a sense of the transcendent, where we have this sense that this is all there is. And you encounter these people day to day, as I do. Our seminary is on a secular campus. Used to be it was founded as a Baptist campus 180 years ago, but in the 60s reverted to the state. And our education in Canada is mostly state education, and so it's a public university. But we have this Baptist seminary in this campus, and so we encounter folks all the time who believe very differently. Who are completely secular. And I will say, this malaise that he talks about, the malaise of immanence, when you don't have a transcendent frame, it is very real. And Taylor talks about this shift from deism, even in culture, from the 18th century onwards, a sense that there was still a God, but God was disconnected from us, to one of humanism, where it's all down to people to make a difference rather than God. And this idea is very much nurtured by Friedrich Nietzsche as well, and the idea that, you know, God is dead, not just because God up and died, but because we come to this recognition that God was never anything more than something we posited from our own brains. And so when we recognize all of that, what are we left with? We're left with this idea: is this all there is? Now we could say how sad for culture that people in culture are thinking that, but if we're really honest with ourselves, I know this to be true, certainly north of your border. I imagine it to be true where you are, but I'm interested to know what you think. If we're really honest with ourselves, we feel it too. There is a sense of, and this was pre-pandemic I'm talking about. It accelerated in the pandemic, this feeling of, I don't know, blah, things are just not right. It's not, you know, I can't get a handle on anything. Everything feels like jello. In the sense of, man, I don't know where things are going. And so I think experientially, we know what this is like too. And I think if we acknowledge that and allow ourselves to feel it and then talk about it, we'll be able to tap into what other people are feeling too, and then the sources of hope. So this is going to be depressing before it's hopeful, as we continue through this material. But I hope you'll stay with me, because I'll pull you back out again at the end, I promise. I'm just going to share some slides with you, and I'll come in and out. The host is disabled participant screen sharing. Would someone be able to turn that on for me? That would be great. Oh, excellent. Thank you. There we are. So the question of how did we get here? How did we get here anyway at this malaise of imminence that I've been talking about? And how has this malaise really led to this crisis of meaning? I'm going to play this song. This is Peggy Lee. I know Peggy Lee predates most of us here, but hopefully you've heard of Peggy Lee before. If you heard of Peggy Lee, and she sang this song back in the 60s, and Charles Taylor refers to this point in the 60s as the Peggy Lee axis. And he calls it the Peggy Lee axis because of this song. And this song that was released, she sings asking that question, is that all there is? And I want you to think about this song. I'm going to play it for you. I want you to listen to it and think about this as the voice of a culture that really came to fruition, that really landed on the pop culture scene by the late 1960s. So have a listen to this and see what you think. Can you hear it all right?
I remember when I was a little girl and our house caught on fire. I'll never forget the look on my father's face as he gathered me in his arms and rushed through the burning building onto the pavement. And I stood there, shivering in my pajamas, and watched the whole world go up in flames. And when it was all over, I said to myself, is that all there is to a fire? Is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball. If that's all there is. And when I was 12 years old, my daddy took me to the circus, the greatest show on earth. There were clowns and elephants and dancing bears, and a beautiful lady in pink tights flew high above our heads. But as I sat there watching, I had the feeling that something was missing. I don't know what, but when it was all over, I said to myself, is that all there is to the circus? Is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball. If that's all there is. And then I fell in love with the most wonderful boy in the world. We'd take long walks down by the river, just sit for hours gazing into each other's eyes. We were so very much in love. And then one day, he went away and I thought I'd die, but I didn't. And when I didn't, I said to myself, is that all there is to love? Is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friend, then I know what you must be saying to yourselves. If that's the way she feels about it, why doesn't she just end it all? Oh, no, not me. I'm not ready for that final disappointment. 'Cause I know just as well as I'm standing here talking to you, that when that final moment comes and I'm breathing my last breath, I'll be saying to myself, is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball. If that's all there is.
Feel uplifted? You can see why Charles Taylor would hang on to that as a pivotal, defining really moment in Western culture. On the one hand, you know, she's talking about, she's asking that whole question, is that all there is? And the song just seems to have no response to that brings any sense of meaning to all of it. Just simply raises the question of the bankruptcy of meaning in that culture. And yet there's still a response. It's very interesting because, you know, she says, I know what you're thinking. Why doesn't she just end it all? And she said, well, I'm not ready for that final disappointment. So what's the response? Well, the response is break out the booze, have a ball, you know, dance, party on, basically. And that really is an existential response. So existentialists, philosophically, of course, believe in the absurdity of human existence. They think that, you know, as human beings, we are the only creatures, as far as we know, who know that we are going to die. And in the face of that, we have to find a reason to get up in the morning. You have to have a reason to put one foot on the floor after the other in the morning, or else you've given up entirely. An existentialist says then that it's not about essence as human beings, it's about existence. It's about how we validate our existence as human beings by the choices that we make in the face of the absurdity of life. And so you had Christian existentialists. I mean, existentialism was founded by Soren Kierkegaard from a Christian perspective, but I'm not going to get, you know, into all that right now. But the French atheist existentialists of the 1960s really picked up on this idea, and they were the ones who you know, raised this question that you know, if this is all there is, what are you going to do then to validate your existence? Where's your meaning? Because human beings can't exist without meaning. So where's our hope? What gets you out of bed? What will keep you going? We validate our existence in a number of different ways in the face of the absurdity of the ultimate reality that we're going to die, and that will be the end. So for her, it's, you know, if that's all there is, then let's party. And other people have over time also adopted that view. Existentialism has become very prevalent in our culture, particularly through the 60s, 70s, 80s, pervaded almost all of our films, our music, and so on. This idea of asserting our significance in the face of the absurdity of non-significance, or insignificance, if that makes sense. And those of us who grew up in the 80s, I don't know if there's anybody here, anybody, you know, 80s kid, came of age in the 80s. For some of you, that's ancient history. But these were really existential days. And the big phrase for us in the 80s was carpe diem, seize the day, you know, go out and make a difference in the world. And it was manifested really in a film like The Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams. So I'm going to show you a clip because I don't think anything explains the role of existentialism in our culture and where it went than this clip. So I'm just going to play that for you. Have a look.
Now, Mr. Pitts. It's a rather unfortunate name. Mr. Pitts. Where are you? Mr. Pitts, will you open your hymnal, page 542? Read the first stanza of the poem you find there.
The virgins to make much of time?
Yes, that's the one. Somewhat appropriate, isn't it?
Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. The Latin term for that sentiment is carpe diem. Now, who knows what that means?
Carpe diem. That's seize the day.
Very good, Mr.
Meeks.
Meeks. Another unusual name. Seize the day. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Why does the writer use these lines?
Because he's in a hurry.
No. Ding! Thank you for playing anyway. Because we are food for worms, lads. Because believe it or not, each and every one of us in this room is one day going to stop breathing, turn cold, and die. I'd like you to step forward over here and peruse some of the faces from the past. You've walked past them many times. I don't think you've really looked at them. They're not that different from you, are they? Same haircuts, full of hormones, just like you. Invincible, just like you feel. The world is their oyster. They believe they're destined for great things, just like many of you. Their eyes are full of hope, just like you. Did they wait until it was too late to make from their lives even one iota of what they were capable? Because you see, gentlemen, these boys are now fertilizing daffodils. But if you listen real close, you can hear them whisper their legacy to you. Go on, lean in. Listen. You hear it?
It's just such a great clip because it emphasizes what the existentialist posits as that absurdity of life. It's going to end. It's going to end quickly. So grab it while you can. Make things happen. Seize the day. Assert yourself into that culture and make a difference. It wasn't long, though, before that kind of impetus gave way to some other influences. As the scientific enterprise, for example, developed and grew, we moved much more into a deterministic culture. Now, determinism differs from existentialism in that rather than making life happen, by asserting your will, life just happens to you. So, of course, as scientific discoveries and the mapping of the genome and so on happened, we realized that actually people don't make things happen as much as they thought they did. Because you found your meaning in asserting your will and making stuff happen, and then suddenly we're told, well, actually, you don't really make stuff happen. Stuff happens to you. You're the sum of your genetics. You're the sum of your environmental upbringing, and a combination of these. And really, the material world is what is primary. It's the thing that defines everything. It's the thing out of which any sense of who we are and any sense of purpose and meaning in the world derives. It's determined. It's determined by our scientific understanding. It's determined by our material being. It's determined by our genes and all of these sorts of things. You saw this actually manifest itself in culture through TV shows like Who Do You Think You Are? Sorry, I don't know why I'm going backwards. Here we go. Who Do You Think You Are? Where people would spend time kind of digging into their own family tree to figure out a sense of purpose, really, is what people are after. One of the biggest money makers on the internet, apart from pornography, is Ancestry.com. And Ancestry.com makes so much money because people want to know who they are. Who am I anyway? I'm not who I assert myself to be. I am my ancestry. because we were moving into this age of determinism. This gets even more specific when genetic testing comes online. So you ended up with services like 23andMe, where you take the swab and you find out who are you then really? Do you come from the Vikings, or do you have Indigenous Americans in your background, and so on? And if you go to some of these websites like 23andMe, some of the ads are extraordinary. So there's one ad, I should have dug it out, but I didn't for today. Where there's two parents in a classroom, their kids are in the same classroom, and they've done this genetic testing and they found out that they're related, like, I don't know, maybe 20 generations ago or something. It's insane. And they're there and they're crying and they're hugging, because now it really means something. We mean something to each other because we found out we have this connection. And, rather than saying, I can reach out to you and choose to love you or reach out to you or make a connection with you, our connection is determined because of where we've come from. And this has really, I think, turned our culture on its head very quickly, because we had this whole generation that was all about carpe diem. Now you have a whole generation that's all about, well, actually, we're just the sum of what went before, and it's made us. Now, so there was just a few years ago, the film Boyhood. Anybody know Boyhood? They traced this guy's life. It was a real time thing, so it was kind of fascinating piece of filmography. But otherwise, well, I'll let you decide. But it was, it really ended up emphasizing this transition. And so I'm gonna show you this clip. It comes from the very end of the film. It's the final scene, and contrast this with the clip we just saw from Dead Poets Society. It's fascinating and is a real insight into contemporary culture. So have a look at this. And I'm going to cough. There is an F-bomb at one point, but it's in the background, so I'll just...
It's like as if all of time has unfolded before us, so we could stand here and look out and scream, fuck yeah!
There we are. It's through the worst.
You know how everyone's always saying, seize the moment? I don't know, I'm kind of thinking it's the other way around. Like, the moment seizes us.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, it's constant. The moments, it's just, it's like it's always right now,
Yeah.
Yep, that's it. That's it. That is all there is. That was extraordinary to me when I watched that film, because I thought, first of all, there's 3 hours of my life I'll never get back. And there's the message in the end. But I really was quite fascinated, because it ended up being, for me, a really clear insight into a lot of millennial and youth culture. And it has resonated with a lot of youth pastors who say, Anna, that is exactly it, because, you cannot get people, and it's not only young people, you can't get people to commit to stuff anymore, right? It's really, really hard. And I couldn't figure, we're all trying to figure this out. Why not? Because, we would commit to stuff because, we're going to make things happen. This is how we were finding meaning in a world that had been bereft of meaning. We make meaning by making stuff happen. And in a deterministic world, you don't make stuff happen. Stuff makes you happen. And so, if you're asking someone to come and, help out with youth group or whatever it is, some project with the homeless, they might come at the last minute, but that's because that moment will make them, right? If at that moment, that's the best thing on offer and so on, that moment will make them, and then they'll come and be part of it. Just as an aside, I think this reality has some huge impact on the way that we approach church structures, to be honest with you, because a lot of us are reluctant to change church structures because they're so entrenched. But I think about, I can see my home church right through my window. very, very reluctant to change structures that are completely outdated, because people will not commit to sit on boards. Why would they? But they will commit to a project. So let's accomplish this project together. That moment will make us, um, rather than us making the moment. But that's just a little aside. Um, what happens after determinism then? Well, I think existentialism and determinism both eventually give way to nihilism. That is a sense of nothing. There's no purpose, no meaning in any of it. So if you think back to Dead Poets Society, you'll remember that the main character, it's long enough, I think I can give the spoiler. The main character, what does he do to assert his will existentially in that film? Well, in the end, he takes his own life, doesn't he? So when he's faced with that question, is that all there is? His great rebellious action is to take his own life. When it comes to something like Boyhood, the moments just make you. It doesn't really matter then where you go. You can see this whole malaise, the sense of meh, just permeating everything. So we end up very much, I think, in a culture that is largely nihilistic. And so how do we respond to that? And maybe you can really, again, I say, this is us. Culture is us. It's in us and we're part of it too. It's not like here's the church and we're all, one thing, culture's out there. This is us too. So what do you do when you're feeling that kind of angst, about, or malaise about your place in the world? Well, shop for a new tie, do some cooking, do some cardio. This feels like us during pandemic, doesn't it? Don't let the existential dread set in. Don't let it set in. Let's just vacuum the rug. I mean, I've had days like this many times, and you probably have had too. Distract yourself from the sense or the feeling that maybe everything is coming to nothing. There was this exhibit that traveled around the world. I think it's still in some places, by Gunther von Hagens in Germany, who it's called a Body Works exhibit, Body Worlds exhibit, and put these bodies on display. And he plasticized bodies, and he would peel them of their skin and arrange them in artistic ways and so on, and really laid bare human life as material. This is all there is. This is it. We are just the sum of our skin and bones and muscle and sinew, and there is nothing else. And a whole culture that feels that way, we can feel, again, very bereft of meaning. So, human beings can't live without meaning. So, where do we find meaning? I was at this time last year in Arizona for a conference, and I saw this picture and the Utopia thing up above it. It was a big billboard as after the plane landed. Utopia, Sedona's outdoor ventures and spiritual experiences replenish the body and mind. So where is this going? Again, in response to a sense of a lack of meaningfulness, we turn to ourselves. We turn very much inward. And this should not surprise us, because Taylor talks about the modern shift from a buffered to a porous existence, or from a porous existence to a buffered existence. This particular picture is by Bosch, and you can see here it's a medieval painting, and it shows how human beings understood their world to be comprised of the cosmos, the heavenlies, that were above and also hell below, but it's all of a piece. That was one whole reality. Whereas when the transcendent has been peeled away and all you're left with is the immanent frame. In other words, God's been taken out of the picture. The world of something that exists beyond who we are, beyond the created, beyond what we can see around us, that is gone. What we're left with is ourselves. And so Taylor talked about a porous existence being, I see myself as part of, a cosmos that stretches beyond what I can see, to a modern buffered self where I am the judge of what is valuable, what is meaningful, what is good, and so on. And so there becomes a real boundary between what is outside and what is inside. And if it doesn't come from inside, it's not real. So the ability to understand or posit or connect with the transcendent becomes very, very difficult, because I have to be the measure of all of these things. And that becomes a very difficult challenge when we're talking about trying to connect people with a sense of the hereafter. And so people look to this porous self almost with nostalgia, actually, when people believed, when we were innocent, rather than now when everything just seems complex and difficult and we don't know what's real. Um, there, we live as though that thick boundary, um, the thick boundary we've posited between us and any sense of God or the cosmos and so on, we live almost as a loss. But many people don't even acknowledge that it's a loss because they don't believe that it ever existed to begin with. And the church sees it as a loss. We regard it often as a loss. There's a loss for culture when we are the measure of existence. Each individual is the measure of existence. And yet that's the reality we have to be able to connect with. And so Taylor talked about the great disembedding, which historically was the disconnection between our ability to reason about things and the way that God would be able to speak. The disembedding is nearly complete when God becomes the object of our own thoughts, because in a porous existence, God was the subject and we were the object. We have turned God into the object, and if he exists at all, we turn to a tyrannical deism, which is unacceptable to us. The idea that God can allow things to happen that are allowed to happen, for example, causes people to turn on their faith. Now, why do people turn away on their faith? Because if God exists only on our own terms, we don't need God anymore. Let's be honest. If God only exists on our own terms, we don't need God anymore. And if God exists on God's own terms, but is powerless to stop the evil, or chooses not to stop the evil and is therefore evil, then we also want to do away with that idea of God. This is a challenge for us that Taylor describes as a crisis of theodicy. And I think it is a crisis of theodicy that is actually, in some ways, easier to address for Christians than we think. When we understand there's a crisis of theodicy, the justification of God in the face of suffering, our quick response is to say, well, let's find ways to justify the existence of God in the face of suffering. I mean, we're theologians after all, right? Isn't that what we want to do? And yet the problem isn't providing a theodicy. The problem is the question that is being asked. That we feel we can put God on trial. If God be God, God is beyond our trial. If God be God, then God does not answer to us, although he reaches out to us and is closer than a brother. But if God be God, he does not account to us. And yet that is how the whole culture has turned God into someone who must account to us. In part, this was because through a modern period, we turned God into a capital P provider. God was the provider. If you needed something, if you needed, enough to eat or so on, God's the provider. God's the one who manages to make that happen. In Western Christianity, I think we've done a lot of the same thing. If you need something, turn to God, whatever it is, as if he's kind of the big Santa Claus in the sky. And that really robs God of God's self and God's self-power, to be honest. But if you need something, turn to him. And so we've reduced God into a capital P provider or a cosmic Santa Claus, which is why we've ended up with this problem with theodicy. Because when you reach a point where you say, well, actually, I can provide most things for myself. I can provide myself with a house. I can provide myself with a car, with some decent clothing, but I still need God for the big things. Like I need God to do something about cancer, and I need God to do something about a tidal wave. I need God to do something about a pandemic. And when we turn to God for those things and God doesn't do what we think God ought to do, then it's very easy to turn away and to let God go and to say that's it. And some of the atheists, of course, writing in the late 20th century, were very quick to point out that there's a great relief in letting go. And they called out with really the voice of an evangelist to Christians to just let go and to find the relief that's inherent in letting go, of trying to posit meaning and to defend God's theodicy in the face of this reality. And think I'm going to skip over it, but on this slide, I would have played for you a section of Leonard Cohen's more quite recent song just before he died, You Want It Darker. If you've never heard it and you can stand being in a dark mood for a few minutes, go ahead and listen to it. But he talks about, he's really facing God down. He says, if you're the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you're the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker? We kill the flame. And he calls out the prayer of Yom Kippur, Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready, my Lord. So he's still arguing with God, but he's really talking about the mess that people have made of the world and that God doesn't seem to have intervened. And he has this one line. He talks about, the candles that get lit, the prayers of many people. And he says, a million candles burning for the help that never came. That to me is a devastating line that is the experience of many in culture who do not have the full understanding of God that we might have. For people in our churches who don't have as full an understanding of God as they might have. And their experience of God is that there's a million candles burning in prayer and at churches, and the help never came. So I'm letting go. How can there be a God? And we should not be surprised then that this sense of malaise in our culture is as real as it is, and a sense of, is this all there is? This seems to be all there is. And then what do we do? How do we work through that? So I'm going to skip over to this slide because this is where we're going to go from here. We're going to have a break in a minute because you guys have been like stellar, and I think probably everybody needs 5 or 10 minutes if that's in your plan, Terry. I don't know, but I want to show you this slide because when I riff on Taylor, these are 3 things I have identified as what I think really manifest this malaise and where they came from and how we might begin to challenge them or reintroduce meaning when we understand them a bit more thoroughly and can think through them carefully. So the first one that we're going to look at is what I've called dystopia, that creates a disconnection, really. The German word Weltschmerz is a cool word, and it simply means world weariness. Are you world weary? I think most of us are world weary. So we're going to look at that, and then we'll look at inertia, that we kind of get stuck, we get distracted, and this is acedia. This is one of the 7 deadly sins for Catholics, but Baptists hardly ever talk about acedia. But I'm telling you, I think it's a tenor of our moment, particularly for leaders. I think we're feeling this one. And then I want to talk about nostalgia, which is tied with the word Sehnsucht. So the Germans have really cool words, although acedia is Latin, not German or Greek, I think. But this one is really about desire, and nostalgia is kind of desire turned backwards. And I think we can encourage people to turn desire forwards. All of this really are touchstones, I hope, for your own thoughts of things that you'll be able to make real in your own setting and take away what you need to take away. But this is really a where I think we'll go next, if that's all right. I'm just trying to catch up on some of the comments here, and I'd love to do that. Someone has said, David, you've said Jewish response to the Holocaust is there. Definitely, absolutely. The post World War II French existentialist is all about the absurdity of life in the face of Holocaust. How could people do such a thing to people? And that birthed not only existentialism, but it birthed the whole of I think the French postmodernism philosophical movement as well. I'd love to talk about that, but that's not exciting for everybody. It might be for us. But yes, so brief break. We're about to do that. And good quote from Sondheim. Thank you. Yes, great. Yeah, Nancy Murphy's book. I have that one too. It's great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your engagement. Love that. Are we going too fast, too slow? Is it okay? Any feedback you have for me before break, I'm really interested in hearing. Okay, great. Well, let's say we'll come back for just about quarter past. Does that sound okay? 10 minutes, or do you want 15, or do you want 20? I don't know what you need for a break. Our Virginia Baptists sort of,
What do you
have
need,
other
Anna?
things to do. Oh, I'm
What?
good. I can go forever. I just keep chatting. That's for
All right,
sure.
let's take 10 then and
All
come back.
right.
Thanks,
And I'll
Anna.
tell you about the painting when we come back.
Okay.
Um, so those three things I want to talk about, dystopia, inertia, and nostalgia. And the first one, of course, being this idea of, here, I'll put the slide up again um, so you can see it. Oh, you disabled me again, host. Thanks so much. This one. So there they are, those three again that we're going to look at. Um, this idea of dystopia being a world weariness has a number of facets. I mean, someone mentioned, I've been reading Ecclesiastes. I mean, so much of this is embodied in Ecclesiastes. Certainly the Koheleth knew what it was to experience this, crisis of meaning, and then where you go to find meaning, and it's empty, and when things fall apart, even once you've posited meaninglessness, how do you keep going? And so, absolutely, this, I think Koheleth is a voice for our day from Scripture for sure, and comes to some helpful conclusions as well that we'll mention as we go. And certainly the Psalms. Yes, I'm glad you're making all these connections, because when I was preparing for this, I thought, oh, I haven't got sort of this scriptural framework. I haven't got time to do all of it. So I'm glad you're doing that work, and I trusted that you would have those insights and skills to do that. So I'm glad that that's the case. But this idea of world weariness, Weltschmerz, is really interesting. And it comes to us in all sorts of ways. It comes to us through the relentless information of tragedy that we get all the time. We drift from news story to news story. We scroll through lists of endlessly depressing news, and it's all brought horribly and terribly near by our devices. Um, this bombardment, I think, leads us straight into cultural lament, and perhaps rightly so. Because before the advent of 24-hour news and instant global communications, we know that news of tragedy and difficult things were filtered by time and by distance. But now we sit and watch with our popcorn, really, as disasters and wars play out right before our eyes. A terrorist attack here, a civil war there, a famine here. It's children essentially dying before our eyes. And this is more than we as human beings are designed to handle. So, a couple of summers ago, we were just tucking into bed. My husband and I, we had tuned the TV to BBC World. It was our usual practice. We've changed that now for all sorts of reasons. This being one of them, but we wanted to catch the headlines, for the day. A lot of people do that. But I was horrified to be watching live a tall apartment building on fire, the flames spreading up the outside of the tower as we watched. And reports were being made of Facebook posts and videos and other social media messages that people inside this tower were trapped and they couldn't get out. And we were basically watching these people die live on our screen right in front of us. Who can forget? What happened in 9/11? Same thing. We were watching people die in front of our eyes, and this has accelerated as time has gone by. Um, and it creates in us a sense of world weariness. It wasn't long later after that evening, that was a fire in London, but not long after, in the same setting, I was relaxing in bed, well fed, comfortable, and safe, and watched tiny starving children on the brink of death in Yemen. And then the story, of course, turned to the devastating circumstances of the Rohingya Muslims. And someone held a bag of skin and bones up to the camera that belied the dignity of the image bearer. And I just could not bear to look anymore. Thankfully, the story turned without me having to change the channel. Oh, but good. Look, the next story was that a new iPhone is being released. Just $1,000 separates you from the next step of personal happiness and supposedly meaning. And so for me, the malaise, the malaise really kicked in. I had pangs of Weltschmerz. There is something very wrong with us. It's all conflated. It's all at once. We don't get the benefit of reflection. We just run from task to task, and we lose a sense of joy in the midst of this cultural malaise. And what do we, here we're left with this. I hope we'll be able to address the question of what we do about this. But this idea of Weltschmerz, that means world pain, is really a profound sense that there's a way the world should be and it's not. And it occurs on an emotional level, but it's in response to things that are actually going wrong in the world. In 2015, one author writing in The Guardian, Oliver Berkman, wrote this: during one of those weeks of exceptionally depressing news headlines just before Christmas, Ari Ratner published an essay arguing it was time to dust off an old German word, Weltschmerz, which translates as world pain. The Germans, as you know, have a word for everything. They presumably feel plenty of Schadenfreude about the fact that the rest of us don't. But Weltschmerz was the one we needed now, Radner wrote, because it encapsulates a sense of grief at how the world keeps falling short of expectations. The special awfulness of the news in recent months has taken varying forms. All of them trigger a feeling that humanity never fails to disappoint. This was in 2015, folks. What's it been like since then? The interesting thing about Weltschmerz is that it's rather easy to connect with, apologetically speaking, because this lack of adequate theodicy we've been talking about, one of Taylor's points of how we experienced that malaise of imminence to begin with, I mean, there's actually a good responsive point here. People do feel that there's a way that the world should be and isn't. And if you've spent any time with C.S. Lewis, you know that that actually becomes his very argument for the existence of God. In his own conversion, it was predicated upon this idea that he had a sense within him that there was a way the world should be and wasn't. And he had to face that down because he had turned away from an idea of God on the basis that God didn't stop these terrible things in the world. Well, how could God exist when these terrible things would happen? And then he realized that he had this sense that there was a way the world should be and wasn't. And he had to confront the question, why do I feel there's a way the world should be if there isn't a God? And I think that is still a powerful apologetic point for us as people of faith to say, why do we feel that if something doesn't happen, that God should have done something about it, and atheists or and so on who look at us after a tragedy and say, where is your God now? You can't ask that question if you are an atheist, because you have no expectation that there's a way the world should be and isn't. That is really a faith perspective. And C.S. Lewis makes this point in Mere Christianity. He realized he had a standard by which he was measuring the world, and so do many people, almost instinctively. As C.S. Lewis would believe, it's a natural theology. And the answer could really only point to a source outside of himself. Here's the direct quote from Lewis. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? Someone doesn't call a line crooked unless there's an idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" I think that our ministry in a culture that experiences world weariness can make this point, as well as it can help us ourselves in our own experiences of it. But how do we begin to understand this on a more deep level? What yields this sense of Weltschmerz? I want to talk just for a few minutes about how media creates the truth. And I've been talking about this years before words like fake news and so on came into common parlance, because you could see this coming from the philosophers, to be honest with you. So I'm just going to do a quick consideration of how media works and special reference to ads, because I think that will give us just a little bit of distance to be able to reflect on it helpfully. So we live in a media-rich society, of course, and I think that contributes significantly to our feeling of malaise and world weariness, because we are not only bombarded with messages, we are actually formed by these messages. And if we think we're not formed by them, we haven't really been paying attention to what's been going on. We're formed by them in all sorts of ways and on multiple levels. When mass media first emerged, it was understood in a structural way. You have a producer, a reader, a referent, and the message of the text. In other words, you have someone who makes the message, someone who reads the message. You have the object or the product usually that it refers to, and then you have the text itself. So, in the early days of soaps, the ads were all about, on the radio, were all about soap. Here's a soap. You should use this soap. It's really good. And then you decide whether you're going to use that same soap or not. As media developed, people realized that it's much more complicated than that, and that you have still the message or the text, the producer, the reader, the referent. But in the middle of there's a whole plethora of meaning that can take place around it. And because there's that whole plethora of meaning, there are different things that if we are talking about ads, the ad can mean a lot of different things. Those of us who are the reader of the text can take away from it a lot of different meanings. So there's a whole realm in there that is not simply from A to B and so on. And yet, so much of this can still be calculated, as we'll see in a few minutes. The way that we can understand this then is through the French atheist philosopher Jean Baudrillard. I think this is his most profound insight, to be honest with you. Baudrillard, as an atheist philosopher, he's very difficult to read. But this piece from Simulacra and Simulation, I think is quite genius. In fact, if you are a fan of the Matrix films, in the very first of the Matrix series, when Neo they knock on the door, and they're getting the mescaline, and he lets them in, and he opens up a book, and it's inside the cutout piece of the book. It's Simulacra and Simulation that is the book. And the chapter, interestingly enough, that's been cut out that they look at is on nihilism. And just as an aside, the reason that's interesting is because Baudrillard thinks the only way to posit meaning in a postmodern world is by enacting violence. And so that then you've got the precept for the whole of the film. Anyway, that's just for a little bit of side interest. Jean Baudrillard writes in Simulacra and Simulation about how contemporary mass media works. And he says that at first, and there are these 4 orders of simulation. The first order is that the image represents the real. So this would be like ads at the time of those soaps. You have an image and something that the company wants us to believe about the product. So the image is that this is good soap. And that image represents what is really there. So there's a soap, it's a good product. The image is that it's good soap, and so they belong together. The image is representative of the real. In the second order of simulation, the image masks the real. In other words, it kind of covers it over in a way. The image is becoming more important than the thing in itself. What is said about it is becoming more real. And the third order, the image masks the disappearance of the real. So what is said about the product, this is just as an example, what is said about the product belies the fact that the product really doesn't exist. So what is said about the product, what you believe about the product has masked the fact that maybe the product is actually rubbish. This soap might not clean anything. It might be awful, but that doesn't matter because the image has come to be everything. So that by the final stage of simulation, the image has been peeled off of the thing. The thing has disappeared from reality, and the image is now masquerading as the real. And so this is how we end up with, in a consumer society where it's just a competition of brands, for example. It's all about the image you can create. It's the same for the world of celebrity. It's all about what you can make people believe about someone that might have nothing to do with who they are at all. It's because of this time I've spent over the last several years with Baudrillard's 4 orders of simulation that you could see coming well before it happened. and I'm not meaning to offend anyone. I hope I'm not, but you could see well before it happened what's gone on in your own situation south of the border, if I may say. You could see it coming because whoever controls the media, who understands the media and can use it to their own power, can create a hyper real. And so the reason it's not that people simply believe lies or untruths. They are left with, there is no real anymore. Do you see what I mean? This unreality has been created that then masquerades as the real or the true. And spin doctors for years have been playing with this idea. Back even in the 90s, some of the most powerful spin doctors in Western governments were saying, if you're accusing me of creating the truth, that's exactly what I do, right? It's about the creation of a truth that then might have nothing to do with reality whatsoever. And this is exacerbated in a consumer society, of course, because we purchase images then, and we use those images to define ourselves, which means that it's almost a never-ending cycle. And we have an increasing sense of not knowing what is real or what is true, or even caring anymore. Again, contributing to this sense of malaise and of world weariness, if I may say, because all we have now is a bombardment of messages. But amongst those messages, we're not even sure what is real, what is true, what they point to, what they demand of us. And so someone raised the issue of agency. If we don't cover that in the next little while together, I would love it if we could return to that this afternoon, because that is hugely significant in the midst of this kind of issue. How can you be a free agent when you are so manipulated by these forces? And that is not paranoia speaking. It's how media works with intent. That's why it works that way. And of course, in a computer era, this is magnified when you have, the whole, I don't know if you followed the Cambridge Analytics issue, but when you have, computer programs that make you, can basically manipulate your vote, can basically manipulate the way you think. It's not simply that people are weak and stupid. These things work with the intention of knowing that if they can make you believe something, then that becomes true for you. It's not just a matter of selling lies. It's a real control issue. And we could see it coming if you saw what was happening in the development of the mass media. So those who have control over mass media really do actually have a great power of control over people's thoughts. And where we stand as church in the midst of this, I would love to talk about agency, but we won't do that right at the moment, I don't think. Maybe in a few minutes. I want to give an example of this with a fun ad, because, if you think about, and you've probably heard some of those early ads from the radio soap days, our soap cleans your clothes really clean, la la la, and it's very basic. But then you get messages now from which we can take all kinds of meaning. So I'm going to show you this Cadbury commercial from a few years back, just to see what you think of it. Can you hear that? Have I clicked the music? Yeah. When I first saw that ad, I thought it was for like the World Wildlife Federation or something, save the gorillas, And I couldn't believe it when he burst out playing Phil Collins drums. I thought that was just wild. And some of these ads have actual online followings in themselves. If you want to talk about, the masquerading of the image for the real. And this is one example, but when the producers were asked about this ad, they said it has nothing to do with chocolate, right? There's like, what does that got to do with chocolate? Um, they said that what we were interested in was producing a feeling that was attached to this image of the white print on the purple background. Because they knew that if they could create that feeling of fun, which is what this is about, when you saw that label, you saw that color, you saw that chocolate bar with Cadbury on it, you would recall that feeling of fun, and then you'd pick that up. Now you can say, oh, well, we're not so easily manipulated. But the reality is that if it didn't work, they wouldn't spend millions of dollars doing it. It works. And we are, it's interesting because in a consumer culture, we think that we are existentialists, that we choose. In fact, the opportunity for us to choose is part and parcel of the success of a consumer culture. You have your choice of all of these kinds of toothpaste. You have your choice of all of these options on your car because you're the one who chooses. When in actual fact, our choices are almost completely manufactured by the advertising to which we are subject. And not only advertising in its classic sense like this, but the algorithms that calculate our preferences online and so on. And I'm always amazed that people say, I was talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken the other day, and there the ad turned up on my phone. Isn't that something? It's not something that your phone listens to you. It's not paranoid. It's fact, right? If you have your voice recognition on your phone, the phone's listening to you and will sell you ads. If you've watched oh um, what's it called, the thing on about social media on Netflix, I don't know if you guys have watched that, but if you haven't, you really should, because it really emphasizes this idea of how we are the product, right? And so it's turned the world upside down, and we still function as though it's the old world, because it's very complicated to function in this world with any degree of depth of understanding. So most people function as if it's the old world, which makes us very vulnerable to these kinds of influences and forces. And so we actually define ourselves on the basis of what's fed to us. And there are some places where we can make choices, but not always. And so when we're caught up in this sort of a media cycle, it's hard to turn our eyes from human existence and turn our eyes to the Lord, to be honest. And we get caught up with replications of ourselves. And so um, and this is really what happens in these orders of simulacra or of simulation that Baudrillard talked about. When the image becomes the real, the image becomes everything, and our identity is found then as human beings in the image that is projected and portrayed, rather than in something else. And if we're deriving our image and our identity from that thing, not only projecting an image and identity, then it has that formative impact on our people. This is really difficult and challenging for us as church, because I've done some research on, and I have a lot more to do, but on the formative impact of ads alone, let alone anything with, that uses particular algorithms and so on to target you, but just simply the ads. They have a huge formative effect. So James Smith, if you've followed him at all, he talks about secular liturgies, the practices of ritual and meaning that we practice within culture. And he says that they need to be countered by spiritual liturgies, the formative things we do in church. So enacting communion, when we take communion, we are enacting a liturgy that is counter-formative to those cultural influences. My pushback to Smith would be that most people are in church for maybe an hour a week. but we are out in the culture experiencing all of these influences the whole rest of the time. So how can you ever begin to match the formative impact of what happens in church with what's happening in the rest of the world? And so unless we can find a way to counter it, my fear is that we're left just simply gazing into a reflection of ourselves, and that we end up doing the same thing even when we're in church. And those of you leading churches know exactly what I'm talking about, that the church ought to be a reflection of my wants and my desires. And in a buffered existence world, like we were talking about earlier, there's a reason for that. And the existence of this kind of media-rich consumer culture really depends on that. And so we enact really these secular liturgies, I think, to a high degree. There are a number of ads. If we had another session together, I'd dig out some of those and show them to you. But we'll see a couple actually together in a little while. But they have a huge formative impact. You know, there are ads on the internet, and you'll have seen some of these that millions upon millions of people have watched. And they watch them not for the product information. They watch them because they carry a moral message. And that message has, I think, a significant formative impact in the way that Smith describes, that we practice these things, we repeat them, and then they have this formative impact on us. And so the challenge for the church is to think afresh, I think, how can we increase the formative impact of what we do beyond a Sunday or a Wednesday night, or those few points of contact that we have with people? And some of the things that have been getting some sense of momentum about them are things like developing your own community for your people. When I say develop your own community, I mean like a monastic style community for people in an urban setting, for example, or in a rural setting, so that everyone is studying in the same piece of scripture. People are connected through their phone groups, through an app or whatever, or in these days it's easier with Zoom and so on. To keep people connected and engaging in a series of practices outside of church life. Now, we've always said, you know, read your Bible and pray every day and you'll grow, grow, grow. You know, I think we may need to be more intentional about what that looks like in these days. And there may be some of you who are already engaging some of those things. It'd be really interesting to hear about that. I supervised a DMin student a couple of years ago. He's in Toronto in a Presbyterian church, and he's developed a whole approach to developing this sort of shared community for his people, because he realized, again, this was pre-pandemic, they were all over the place. They're, you know, medical doctors and business people and students and people who are homeless, and they're just all over the place. But he realized everybody had a phone. So they got connected into triplets. They pray together and so on, but they don't have to be together to do it. And so again, in this post-pandemic context, our ability to use the media positively, I think there's a great potential there. But the creation of counter community is, we're going to have to be really creative about this, I think, and think about what in each context what your people need. So what his people need in an urban context is very different from what folks I live and work with here in a rural context would need, but it could look very much the same in terms of structure and so on. But that's something I think we're going to have to be very seriously contemplating if we're going to meet people in a world weariness where meaning is at a loss, because meaning is just lost in these messages that come through the media, and nobody knows what is true, and nobody knows what is real, and nobody knows what to believe anymore. The countercultural formative influences, I think we have to be very intentional about them. And so one of the things we can do in a world of Weltschmerz and so on, and this is particularly true in the time of pandemic, is provide a place of lament. I don't think lament has the last word. I'm kind of I'm a natural optimist, but lament is key, I think, at the moment. And if you haven't come across, for heaven's sake, mind blank, I'm picturing his face, Tom Wright. If you haven't come across Tom Wright's recent stuff that he put out during the pandemic on lament, it's very helpful to give voice to the sense of death and loss and that world weariness that, man alive, if we had world weariness before last March, we sure have it now. And to have space for people just to lament and to express and so on is huge. They don't have a place in culture to do that, really, not really, not with any degree of depth or meaning or time spent with it. And then to think afresh, what would formative liturgies look like for the church that go beyond a Sunday? What would that look like? What do we need to be nurturing people with so that they are formed in the likeness of Christ, at least in a force that's equal, if not greater than the force in culture? So that's a huge issue, I think. I'd like to move on to the next one, but I also want to pause if there are things that that we need to clarify from that session.
Could you elaborate a little more? The French atheist philosopher, I don't remember his name, you mentioned that meaning was found in doing acts of violence, that was his ultimate conclusion. Could you parse that out a little bit more? I dropped a Timothy Snyder quote in the chat, the Yale historian, who he recently wrote that post-truth is pre-fascism, and that's pretty darn scary right now. And this idea that when there is no truth, finding meaning in violence is we're seeing that played out. So I'd like to hear some more about that.
Yeah, we really are. Again, we can all be prophets, right? I mean, because again, I've been seeing this coming for years, and when it plays out, you almost can't believe it that it was so obvious in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I'm just going to dial back for a little bit and talk about postmodernism as a philosophy. So you probably know that as a philosophical term, postmodernism moved into the public realm with the publication of Jean-Francois Lyotard's book, a report on knowledge, and it was about postmodernity. He was a French scholar who was hired by the Quebec government here in Canada to do a report on knowledge in higher education. In other words, they wanted him to look at higher education across the Western world and figure out what actually has changed, because they sensed a sea shift had happened and they wanted to know what it was. So they hired him to do this study. And so he wrote The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, out of his research. And basically what he saw was that in the higher institutions, thought was moving away from meta-narratives, the big stories that explained everything, and moving towards what he described as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. That is a disbelief that there are big stories that explain everything. There was a rejection of this idea, and it was manifested in post-communism, the idea that a revolution could explain everything. It was a rejection of that. It was a rejection of Christianity, that there's a big story of God that can explain everything. It was a rejection of colonialism, that there's a way of living or being culturally that everyone should adopt. Anything that's the big story. Capitalism, that this is a big story that explains everything. So meta-narratives were rejected because if you read other postmodern philosophers, you'll see there's a turn away from the rational, because they realize that that can't go anywhere other than Nietzsche and nihilism at the end of the day, and a turn towards language, but also a recognition that when you speak, speaking provides meaning, but speaking also provides violence. Because, for example, you're sitting there listening to me. I have power of violence over you. As I speak, I could be enacting a violence over you, because you are your freedom is being limited because you're listening to what I'm saying. I'm making you think things you might not have thought otherwise. So I have a great power here that is a power over you. And so language is then seen not only as a game, but as something that takes power one over another. So Lyotard referred to this as well, using Wittgenstein, and he said that that really what would result at the end of postmodernism was the emergence of ever new modernisms. In other words, my ideas are right for everyone and your ideas are right for everyone. And this fragmentation into small stories, small narratives, but those narratives seeking for themselves the power of truth. And so he said, what you end up then is a war of all against all. It can't be any other way when you have this fragmentation of narrative, right? You end up with a war of all against all. And so really out of that, that kind of idea, I think, is where Baudrillard grew his idea that when the sense of truth breaks down and so on, you have nothing left except, I mean, consumerism tries to fill the hole, but consumerism just becomes a sarcophagus against death. You know, you're dead already, but you're in the coffin. You know, you pretend that you're not. But for him as a nihilist and giving into nihilism, he said the only way to subvert nihilism, and he doesn't really offer any particular reason for that, but he posits very strongly the only way to push back at nihilism is through violence, a violent act like a suicide or a revolution. And so the Matrix is a perfect example of this, that, you know, we watch the Matrix and we're all on the side of the rebels, right? But really they're simply enacting violence against the system as they're positing meaning. The meaning isn't in the system, it's in the violence they're enacting. And so, you know, that you could connect that also with the suicide of the hero in Dead Poets Society. You know, he had no meaning. He couldn't enact. The way he wanted to posit meaning was in enacting a suicide. And so violence in our world, I think you're right. We're seeing it all around us. People are not finding the meaning anywhere else, and they will find it where they must. And violence is the place where you find meaning when there's no big story that explains anything anymore. Because your story is all there is, and if you're gonna make your story mean something more, you have to enact that violence and take power over other people. So I don't know if that clarifies or confuses, to be honest.
Well, of both. Thanks.
Right. Right. It is fascinating. I wrote an article actually on how we could use that kind of we can use that to take a whole different view of what Jesus was doing on the cross, to be honest, because that was a violent death that I suggested subverted the consumer system in which we seem to be trapped. And the violent death of Christ provided a reconciliation that would not have been possible otherwise. So anyway, there's just a thought on that. I can give some links to some of that stuff later if that's helpful. Good. Well, you guys are patient and very helpful that some of you are at least still looking awake. So thank you for that. Let's move on quickly to look at inertia, how we get stuck before we turn to nostalgia, which I know everyone's looking forward to. I think I'm going to skip some of this stuff on inertia. And I think what I want to, the point that I would like to make on that so that we can spend more time on nostalgia, I want to be responsive to that. This idea of acedia that provides an inertia, I think is a really interesting concept again for us, particularly as leaders. Now, acedia is an interesting concept. As I mentioned, it's a Catholic concept much more than a Protestant concept. As one of the deadly sins, 7 deadly sins that they would describe, they often use the word sloth to translate the word acedia, but sloth really doesn't do it justice in all sorts of ways, because we think of sloth really as laziness. And most leaders I know aren't lazy, but I do think we suffer from acedia overall in our culture, and something to which we are also vulnerable. So I'm going to describe acedia as it was described by one of the early church fathers in the first 3 centuries, and see if it sounds familiar to you at all. This is by John Charles Nault in The Noonday Devil, and he's quoting Evagrius of old. And this was described by the monks who lived in the desert, and were spending their long days transcribing texts. So the demon of acedia is called the noonday demon. That's from the Psalms, of course. It's the most oppressive of all the demons. He attacks the monk at about the 4th hour, that's 10 a.m., and besieges his soul until the 8th hour, that is 2 p.m. First of all, he makes it appear that the sun moves slowly or not at all, and that the day seems to be 50 hours long. And then he compels the monk to look constantly towards the windows, to jump out of the cell, to watch the sun to see how far it is away from 3 o'clock, to look this way and that, lest one of the brothers might have the good idea of coming to distract him from the monotony of his cell. And further, he instills in him a dislike for the place and for the state of life itself, for manual labor, and also the idea that love has disappeared from among the brothers and there's no one to console him. And should there be someone during those days who has offended the monk, this too the demon uses to add further to his dislike of the place. He leads him on to a desire for other places where he can easily find the wherewithal to meet his needs and pursue a trade that is easier and more productive. In other words, what he's talking about are people who have been called to the service of God. They've been called as Christians, and further than that, they've been called to service. But as they labor, they get bored, right? They get bored and they start to seek for distraction. Now, they didn't have a lot of distractions. Our world is full of distractions that we can avail ourselves of that we don't even have to make an effort to find. And so he says, so first of all, he makes it appear as though the sun moves slowly or not at all. So the day seems to be 50 hours long. I'm sure you've never had a day like that ever. And then he compels the monk to wait and see if someone will come and distract him. You know, one of the other brothers, come and talk to me. And because as he invites him to come and talk to him, you know, he's not doing the work that God's given him to do. And then no one comes. And so it's, well, these people are no good anyway. I hate this place. Right, is basically what happens. These guys aren't helping me out. Why didn't they come? I hate this place. And then you say, and then he remembers the people who offended him before. Oh, well, they're all rubbish, right? I don't like any of them. They don't like me. I don't like them. I don't like this place. I'm giving up and I'm going to find some other piece of work somewhere else that I can do without these people hassling me. And so, but nothing has actually occurred other than this process within our own souls. And I think we live in an age where we are prone to this in all sorts of ways because the distractions are so readily available to us. I think it happens with leaders who get distracted either with pornography or with gaming or whatever it is. There's, you know, you look at Japan, there's an entire generation of kids who won't leave their house because they're gaming and they're addicted, and it's a recognized condition. And this, you know, it manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. And we live in a culture again where distraction is part of what we are sold, because again, if you're watching films, you're being sold products. If you are watching a Netflix series, you're being sold products. And as we've seen in the Social Network film, you are the product. It makes it easy. And as we are distracted from the things that God has given us to do, we waste our time as the church. And it sounds preachy, I know, and it's hard not to be preachy when you're saying, well, everybody's just wasting their time. It's not to say that leisure doesn't have a good. Leisure, of course, has a good, but we have moved beyond leisure to make leisure really our main focus. And as long as leisure is distracting us from the task that God has given us to do, we're failing in the task. And I think this again contributes to this sense. It both is born from the sense of malaise and continues to contribute to a sense of malaise. And we are, as we are seeking distraction from all of the things that come at us. There are a couple of clips I want to show you that will illustrate this. So this one is, I think this is the one I mean is, yeah. This one I'm going to show you is, was a band ad actually. Hang on, I'll just share my screen quickly for this one. There, you can just look at that. So life is short, play more becomes the idea. And so we developed a whole culture that worked through the week in order to get to the weekend to play, that works through the year in order to get to the vacation, to have a good time. And our priorities have been shaped that way because, again, they suit the needs of consumer culture. They don't necessarily suit the call of the kingdom of God. And so, how, again, the challenge is so clear. How do we ourselves resist that pull on our time and our attention to be distracted? Like you, I'm a very busy person. There's much to be done. You feel like you're at it all the time. But when you think at the end of the week and you get that little report that says you spent X number of hours on your phone, okay, some of it was work, but some of it was Facebook. There's always these things. That's a minor thing in some ways, but not a minor thing, because just like these monks of old, we've been given a task to do, and it's so easy to be dragged away from it by distraction. That is really a distraction that in many senses is designed and sought after to bring us comfort from the malaise that we're feeling, that is absolutely genuine. So the question is, if we were talking about lament and liturgy as a potential for reintroducing meaning to the issue of dystopia, for inertia, for being stuck in this kind of entertainment phase, I think perspective and perseverance are things that we can nurture. It doesn't sound exciting. I know this one doesn't sound creative and exciting, but it's interesting that the early monks believed that the resolution for acedia was simply perseverance. It sounds awful, but they said, but if you persevere through that moment, when you feel like throwing in the towel, when you think you're going to give it up, when you're ready to walk away to anything else, and you persevere through that moment, they said ineffable joy comes to you when you break through that moment. And the thought of I don't know how people have gone through this pandemic time without an understanding of who they are in the kingdom of God, because there have been times I've just pulled in the driveway and I thought, man alive, if I didn't have this sense of purpose and meaning that I have in kingdom service, I'm not sure I wouldn't throw in the towel myself. Do you know what I mean? Because it lays everything bare. The distractions are less, and we're desperate for even more and more distractions to get us through this time, when this is a time we could really be focused on the things that God would have for us. There's a poem I came across um, some time ago. I'm trying to see if I can find the first part of it, but it's about how someone just really continued their focus, even in the midst of distractions, on a very simple thing, and about how after a flood in this Italian church, they came just to paint blue squares on the wall, just blue squares on the wall after the flood damage. And nearly every day for a year, I painted squares of blue, cobalt blue with madder rose, viridian, lamp black, pure pigments in the strained yolk of an egg, and then penciled notes about the powders, the percentages of each. I never asked to what end I was doing what I did, and now I'll never know. Perhaps there was one square that matched the mantle of a penitent, the stiff hair of a donkey's tail, a river calm beneath a bridge. I don't even know what I learned, except the possibilities of blue and how God enters. And just that waiting on God, and in the perseverance, God turns up, which is worth the wait. Well, there's a lot more we could say about that, but I see that we need to get on to nostalgia because it's great. And I'm just going to get rid of this one. Hang on, let me stop my share. Right. Okay, hang on to your hats. This is my favorite one too. And I came to it last in this framework. But I'll just share these slides. Hang on. We're at the last one. You're thinking, thank goodness. Are you familiar with this Netflix series? It's from a few years ago, 13 Reasons Why. 13 Reasons Why was hugely popular, and it traced the A girl in high school, she took her own life, and she left 13 tapes for 13 different people to explain to them the role they had in her death. Very depressing, right? Apart from the fact that the entire series, at least the first series that I watched, I didn't watch the second one, had 0 moments of redemption in it. It was a really fascinating thing, and I think what I found most fascinating really emerged in the very first show, quite early on. The whole series had a very a retro feel to it. The kids listened to cassette tapes. The whole, the 13 tapes were cassette tapes, and they had Walkmans, and they had a cassette. One guy had a cassette tape player in his car, and it really had this feel. But yet there are these young kids in high school, and what really depressed me in that first episode was this statement, because the voiceover was, everything was better before. Everything was better before. And this was the voice of young kids in high school. And I think the reason it hit me so hard was because I thought, kids in high school, they're the ones who are supposed to say, everything was rubbish before. We're going to do it the right way. The things that our parents did were terrible. We'll move past that. We'll do it better. We'll assert ourselves in the world. It will get better. And then I realized that for me, that's a perspective as an 80s kid in the seize the day mentality. Whereas for them, everything was better before. And I thought, wow, this can't be true, because how can a generation grow up thinking that their future is worse than what was before? How can you think that? Where do you get a sense of meaning and purpose in the midst of that? So I was speaking with a group of students at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and that's one of Canada's top universities. And these smart Christian kids were there. And I asked them this question, because I had just kind of been thinking about this at the time. And I said, you don't really think everything was better before, do you? And they just looked at me, and I said, can you say anything? Can you speak? And they said, well, they just shrugged and said, well, yeah, it was, wasn't it? And I said, why do you think that? And they said, well, that's what everybody tells us. That's the message we hear, that it was easier to be a Christian. It was, it was easier to make something of your life, and so on and so forth. And I thought, what a terrible thing that we have bequeathed to a generation the basic commitment that everything was better before. And so that sent me on this journey of looking at how nostalgia has contributed to this culture of malaise that we were talking about. Because if ever there was malaise, it has to be this idea that everything was better before. And we got to move past that. Sorry, I'm going to just play this. This is an ad, because the fact that we feel that everything was better before is actually intentional in terms of how, again, media sells things. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I just wanted to show you an example as an example.
Might not remember us, but we met in the 90s. We are members of Generation Y, as in yin yang, yo-yo. Life moved a little slower. Discs were square, desktop folders had personality. Extra storage space was just a zipper away. There was only one social network, but most of your friends died of dysentery. The only thing buzzing in your pocket was a pet, until that died too. But at least the troll was still a friend. Lunch was a puzzle, not a picture. You were pumping jams, water, shoes. You didn't have to worry about a news feed full of farm animals. You were busy feeding wild animals. A haircut didn't cost $60. It cost 4 minutes. You really had nothing to lose. Unless, of course, you were playing for keeps. The future was bright. You grew up. So did we.
That is just one of a million examples. Nostalgia is an interesting power. Neil Burton in Psychology Today says nostalgia is sentimentality for the past, typically for a particular period or place with positive associations, but sometimes also for the past in general, like the good old days of yore. And at the end of Andre Brink's novel, An Instant in the Wind, the character of Adam memorably says this: the land which happened inside of us, no one can take away from us again, not even ourselves. And so nostalgia combines the sadness of loss with the joy or satisfaction that the loss is never complete and nor can ever be. So mortal though we are, whatever life we have snared from the legions of death is forever ours. And we all know that this is a feeling within us. When you look at an ad like that, it inspires a sense of, wow, weren't those good days? Remember that? And it lifts us, it cheers us, and it brings a sense somehow of lightness and maybe even meaning in the midst of a malaise, a culture of malaise. Um, it's the kind of thing that I often think about. Christmas is the perfect nostalgic moment, how Western people celebrate Christmas around the Christmas tree and the family is together, and it's always the pictures, everybody's always smiling, and that's how we remember it. We remember our school days. The sun was always out, things were always good, and we filtered out, so the past seems like it was better, and it creates in us a sense of desire. And um, nostalgia is used in marketing with intent. This is something that's really quite fascinating, that marketers intentionally tap into nostalgia because they know it elicits those feelings. I have a clip from Mad Men. If we had time, I'd show it to you. As those men working in an advertising agency discuss the power of nostalgia in advertising and how you recreate for people a sense of meaning and purpose by turning their attention backwards. But marketers have really got a hold of this. So they know, for example, in our consumption choices like TV shows, sneaker brands, films, and so on, they give us a sense of meaning because it's one of the things left that we can share with other people in this world that we've talked about that is so fragmented, multiple narratives, buffered self, and so on. Where do we get a sense of shared meaning apart from violence, a violent cause? In the past. Remember when you can have a shared moment on that. In the day of Netflix, not everybody's watched the same thing. Not everybody listens to the same stuff in an age of streamed music, but we all shared the past. And so we can find a sense of commonality in that moment, in that past. And the marketers know this, and the filmmakers know this. And so they actually put things on a 20 to 40 year cycle. So franchises that are 20 to 40 years old appeal to the nostalgic memories of those aged 35 to 55, which is the demographic where earnings and spendings start to peak. And so franchises from that era are just old enough for younger generations to view them as new, while their parents are looking at them nostalgically. Do you see what I mean? And then that creates in the kid a sense of nostalgia that they in 20 and 30 years time will pass on to their own kids. So when you hear the mantra, there is nothing new today, and there's no new ideas, nobody comes up with anything new. It's not that there's a lack of ideas. It's that there's money in the old ideas. That's the key, right? And so, for example, a couple of years ago, I went to see the movie Bumblebee, the Transformers movie Bumblebee with my son. Now, for me, I wasn't expecting much, but I actually ended up really enjoying it because the soundtrack was an 80s soundtrack. The feel of the movie was an 80s feel, and he loved it because it was the Transformers. And that is a perfect example of something that was about 30 years old, generating back, creating a new audience. And if you look at what is being released in the theaters and so on, it's almost to a 20, 30, sometimes a 40-year cycle, perfectly timed. The franchises go round and round and round. So the millennials who were a few years ago just discovering Iron Man for the first time, they'll be sharing it with their children in another 20 years time, or however that goes, whichever the generation is. The cycle then begins anew. And so we shouldn't be surprised. My husband and my son, even though we're old parents to him as a 12-year-old, all of my husband's Star Wars cards are out. You know, all the stuff that he had as a kid is all out again, and it will go around again. And some things we're seeing come back 2 and 3 times. But why do they tap into this? I think that's a key question. Is it simply because things were better before, or we want them to be better? This word sehnsucht, and I can stop sharing that. I don't think we need to go there, except you should see this. This slide, I love this slide. I'll let you just take a quick peek at that one before I stop sharing. C.S. Lewis again talked about sehnsucht. He saw sehnsucht as sometimes translated as nostalgia, but also as desire. And sehnsucht within us, the sense of nostalgia, is in some ways itself unidentifiable. But it is the thing that we love the feeling of it more than the thing we desire. You know, that feeling that it rises up in us, and it is a feeling of desire. And sometimes it is turned towards the past. And when it's turned towards the past, it is turned towards the past as nostalgia. But Lewis would argue that this sehnsucht within us, that those marketers tap into, that feeling that we want to feel more than the experience itself, that we're in love with that feeling, want to recreate that feeling. It's a flock of geese at dawn. It's the frost on a tree. It's those times that we shared. It's that sunny childhood, that feeling that it elicits in us that is so deep and powerful. Lewis says is our God-given desire for him. Our God-given desire for God's self, to be united with God. And when we turn it backwards, we're looking for that. We're looking to recreate the feeling that we experienced when we stood on that mountainside and looked out at the sunset, or whatever it was in us that inspires that thing. And so in a marketing culture, of course, it will be tapped into by these franchises that roll over and over and over, when in fact what's within us is something much, much deeper, that is our desire for God. And because nothing else will ever satisfy that profound desire that is turned backwards and nostalgia. And what would happen if we actually push that feeling, that sehnsucht, that desire, instead of backwards, but forwards? We can see scripturally, for example, that exile is really the mantra of nostalgia. You know, here we sat down by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, remembering the past, rather than saying, well, here's where we are. How do we move forward from where we are with this sense of desire? And I would like to argue that although creation sings and groans, and although there's a place, we have to remember, if we're going to make real in the present what happened before. I believe that our nostalgia, we have to work hard to intentionally lean forward into our nostalgia eschatologically. And if you have no eschatology, as people without faith don't have a sense of that things will come to a fruition or fulfillment in any specific way, then you can only lean backwards. You can only lean backwards with this sense of purpose, of desire that God has given to us. And so I think we can do a couple of things. We can look at, I want to talk about that as another atheist, but that gets distracting. We can lean forward into hope is what I think we can do. We can lean backwards into these memories and find solace there and comfort there, or we can lean forward into an unknown, which is scary. But we have to live it anyway. And so we can lean into that with hope if we understand that the future is not only held by God, but guaranteed by him. We don't live only as though the future will come, but we live in light of the future. We live in light of the fact that God's kingdom is fulfilled, and we live that reality in the midst of a broken and hurting culture that is full of malaise, but we live as those harbingers of hope, pointing forward to the future and pointing that desire forward. I think it's helpful for us to understand where that desire comes from and what it's for, and why nostalgia is so prevalent in our society. And it's because you get a lot of power over people when you harness that passion, because it is ultimately a passion for God. And I would say, yeah, I think it's one where whether you believe in personal enemy or a more generalized enemy, it's one where enemy has got control and pushed our desire for God backwards into time. And I think it's incumbent upon us to lean forward, to know that Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday and today and forever, leads us on into this time and this place. So what more would we want to do than to, in a post-pandemic context, to say, man alive, it was better before. Can we not just go back? Can't we just do what we did before? And that is not a choice for us at all. And all of these things that have been accelerated in pandemic are going to need we're going to need to lean forward into our sehnsucht, into our desire for God, and say, God, we desire nothing more than to fulfill your mission in the current context. Show us what we need to do that isn't just simply rehashing what went before. I know a number of churches that say, can't wait until we're back in person, can't wait until we're off, not online anymore. As a seminary, we're actually starting to contemplate, how do we train as many pastors for digital ministry as for in-person ministry, because that's where it's going. There's no question in my mind that's where it's going. And it's a hard one because we like to be in person and so on. And it's easy to say, well, remember when we used to teach and everybody was in the class? We're never going back. We're just not ever going back. And so if we can acknowledge that passion of nostalgia is actually a longing for God, and if we can express that in a longing to make God known in the present, because He has guaranteed the future, I think we can make a lot more headway in the days that come. I think we're near break time, but I do want to say this, that I think that when it's clear to us what our mission is, that then refocuses us in this culture of malaise. It gives us a sense of purpose beyond the weariness that we experience. It renews us inwardly day by day. The Spirit of Christ renews us inwardly day by day. And that task to be ambassadors of Christ in a world that is in desperate need of reconciliation can really rise to the fore. And it's going to be tricky times for pastoral leaders, because churches are, if yours are anything like ours, leaders are way ahead of where the churches are in terms of understanding this, and being able to help people move forward is going to be the biggest challenge. And it will be tempting by times to jump ship and do something new, and that will be right. And there will be times when it'll be the right thing to bring people along more slowly. But there's no question that it has to happen. If people think, well, no, it won't happen in my lifetime or whatever. Yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to happen fast, because we become so cozy in Babylon. I believe we're being shaken out, and it's for our good. It's uncomfortable and it's hard, but it's for our good as a church, and it will help us to be the witness that we need to be. I've been inspired in these times by the story of the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in Lebanon. You probably may or may not know it, but they're good partners of us as Canadian Baptists. And when the pandemic hit, already from the explosion they'd had in Beirut, they were housing people. But when the pandemic hit, they just simply opened the doors. They were housing people from who are frontline workers, so they could be isolated and not contaminate people. And so that when the blast happened, they were already in the practice of doing that. And they didn't have to even have a committee meeting to know what to do when tragedy hit. And I love that witness. Can you imagine a church that knows what its mission is, that you don't even have to have a committee meeting to know you got to help people? It's astonishing. And so my prayer for the church is that that's who we'll be. We'll be so focused on the mission of Jesus. We'll understand how we're compromised by culture, so that we can stand out and say, but the kingdom of God demands this of us in this time, in this place. And we're going to lean forward into hope, because this world needs a sense of meaning that has been lost in a culture of malaise. There's one of my favorite stories at the moment that I'm sitting with in scripture is the young man in Mark 10, because he had so much power and wealth, but he wanted one more thing that he didn't have, which was eternal life, of course. And he knows the commandments: don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness. These are all things he knows about, and these are all things he can control. Isn't that interesting? Because he emphasizes the second set of the second half of the commandments, that are all the things that he can do, he can control. And when Jesus says, he says, I've kept all these since my youth, and Jesus looks back at him with love. I love this. He looks back at him with love. And he says, there's one thing you lack: go sell everything, trade it for treasure in heaven. And the young man goes away sad, of course. Jesus was reminding the young man that those commandments he mentioned relate to his behavior, but the first ones outline his relationship with God. No gods before me. And that young man had another God. And Jesus wanted more for him, to let go of the control, the things that he could control, and simply become controlled by God, to be the ruler of his life and future. In a way, he was in exile from God, enjoying the fullness of privilege around him rather than surrendering to the mission of his life, to God's mission. I think the great opportunity for us in these days is to release control, to go for the ride that the Spirit of God is taking us on in these times. Leading in these days is no question like walking in a fog, right? And so we focus on what we can calculate, keep the offerings up, keep the worship service going, keep the building ready. What would it like if we left control of everything and just said, God, what do you want us to do to serve your mission in the world today? Imagine it. Imagine it. And I wonder what could be waiting for us if we were willing to ask that question: what are we really here for? And my prayer is that you'll be inspired as you think about those things, and that you'll do some amazing things with your people in your churches post-pandemic. I'm aware, Terry, that our time is up. But we're going to have time for Q&R this afternoon, and I hope maybe some dreaming together, some thinking and imagining together about what it could look like where you are, and so on. But if there are specific things you want to tackle, then. Quick note on the painting: Stephen Rood is a local Nova Scotia artist, and this is my son leaning on a boat. He's 12. He's David, and Stephen is his best friend's dad, and that's my husband standing there. He was born in Quantico, Virginia, but he was born to a Canadian military officer who was serving there at the time. So he is Canadian, but was born in Virginia. There we go. It's been great. I'm sorry. I feel like it's been a bit of a fire hydrant at you, and that's the difficulty of not being in person, Terry. But thank you.
It is, and you certainly have been a prophet. We're not going to stone you because we know there is truth in what you're saying. I can sense that these clergy persons are thinking already. There's a lot of institutionalized thinking in the church that I serve, and they think I'm holding the dynamite to blow it up. But it sounds like there are a lot of other factors that are at play, and you have certainly made us aware of some of those. So this is the time to go and enjoy some lunch, get some nourishment, to reflect on what you've heard. Come up with your own questions to raise this afternoon with Anna, and Megan will be a part of that conversation as well. So bring your questions, bring your reflections, and based on what Anna just said, bring your ideas of how you are going to move into this uncertain time when you know that people are looking for certainty.